Tony Bennett first noticed the package on a Tuesday morning in October, sitting innocuously on the doorstep of his Central Park West apartment building. The brown paper wrapping was neat but unremarkable, addressed simply to Mr. Anthony Benedetto in careful block letters, with no return address. The doorman, Carlos, had no idea who had delivered it. "I found it here when I arrived for my shift at 6 a.m., Mr. Bennett," Carlos explained apologetically. "Security cameras were down for maintenance yesterday, so we have no record of who left it." Tony examined the package carefully. At 97, he had learned to be cautious about unsolicited deliveries. Too many decades in the public eye had taught him that unexpected packages could contain anything from harmless fan letters to dangerous threats. But something about this particular package felt different, personal rather than menacing. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, Tony found a black and white photograph from what appeared to be the 1950s. The image showed a young man who looked remarkably like Tony at age 25, standing outside a small nightclub with his arm around a beautiful woman Tony didn't recognize. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "Chicago, 1951, before everything changed. Package 1 of 7. Tony studied the photograph intently. The young man was definitely him. He recognized his own smile, his posture, even the way he held his shoulders. But he had no memory of this photograph being taken, no recollection of the woman, and no clear memories of being in Chicago in 1951. His early career was a blur of small venues and forgotten faces, but this image suggested a relationship significant enough to photograph and preserve. Along with the photograph was a single sheet of paper containing just 4 lines, written in the same careful handwriting as the address. "You promised to remember her. You promised to come back. You promised to write. Some promises matter more than fame." Tony felt a chill of recognition mixed with confusion. The words triggered something deep in his memory. Not specific recollections, but emotional echoes that suggested this message referred to something real and important from his past. He showed the photograph and note to his wife Susan, who studied them with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades helping Tony manage his memory, as Alzheimer's gradually stole pieces of his past. "Do you recognize her, Tony?" Susan asked gently. Tony stared at the photograph, willing himself to remember. "She looks familiar, but I can't place her. The early 1950s was such a chaotic time. I was performing in so many small clubs, meeting so many people. It's possible I knew her and just forgot." "The note suggests you made promises to her, important promises." Tony nodded grimly. "That's what worries me." The second package arrived exactly 1 week later, again left anonymously on the doorstep. This one contained another photograph, this time showing the same woman alone, sitting at a piano in what appeared to be the same nightclub. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression of profound sadness. On the back, "Chicago, 1952, waiting for promises to be kept. Package 2 of 7. The accompanying note read, "She played piano like an angel. She sang your songs better than you did. She believed every word you said. Where were you when she needed you?" Tony felt a growing sense of dread. The photographs and notes were clearly building towards some revelation about a relationship he couldn't remember, but which had obviously been significant to this mysterious correspondent. The third package, arriving punctually the following Tuesday, contained a photograph that made Tony's hands shake. It showed the same woman, but she was noticeably thinner, sitting in what appeared to be a hospital bed. She was still smiling, but her eyes held a weariness that spoke of serious illness. The back read, "Chicago, 1953. Still believing you would come. Package 3 of 7. The note was longer this time. She waited 18 months for you to return. She kept the engagement ring you gave her. She told everyone you were coming back to marry her. She defended your absence even when her friends said you had abandoned her. She died believing you still loved her. Tony stared at the word engagement in horror. An engagement ring? A promise of marriage? How could he have forgotten something so important? Tony, Susan said carefully, is it possible that during your early career when you were struggling and traveling constantly, you might have made commitments that you couldn't keep? Tony tried desperately to access memories from that chaotic period of his life. The early 1950s had been a time of constant uncertainty, performing in small clubs for little money, trying to establish his career, often staying in cheap hotels and taking whatever bookings he could get. It was entirely possible that he had met someone, formed a relationship, even made promises that later became impossible to fulfill as his career demands changed. I don't know, Tony admitted. But if I promised to marry someone and then disappeared from her life, if she died waiting for me to return, that's unforgivable. The fourth package arrived with devastating punctuality, and its contents changed everything Tony thought he understood about his own character. The photograph showed a funeral service with the same woman lying in an open casket surrounded by flowers. She appeared to be very young, perhaps 30 at most. Several people were gathered around the casket, including an elderly couple who were obviously her parents and a priest performing the service. On the back, Chicago, 1954. The promises that died with her. Package 4 of 7. But it was the note that accompanied this photograph that shattered Tony's world. Her name was Catherine Rose Martinelli. She was 28 years old when she died of tuberculosis. She was pregnant with your child when you left Chicago. She lost the baby in her 6th month, 3 weeks after you stopped answering her letters. She never told anyone you were the father. She protected your secret even as she died of a broken heart. Her parents never knew why she refused to marry Michael Torino, who courted her for 2 years after you left. They never knew she was waiting for a man who had already forgotten her name. Tony collapsed into his armchair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was learning about his own past. A child, a woman who had died waiting for him. Promises that he had apparently broken so completely that he had no memory of them. Tony, Susan said, tears streaming down her face. This can't be entirely your fault. You were young, your career was unstable, communication was difficult in those days. Maybe you tried to contact her and the letters never reached her. Maybe there were circumstances you couldn't control. But Tony was remembering fragments now. Not specific details, but emotional memories triggered by the name Catherine Rose Martinelli. He remembered a feeling of profound guilt that had haunted him in the mid-1950s, a sense that he had left something important unfinished. A woman's face that had appeared in his dreams for years after his career began to take off. I think I did love her, Tony whispered. I think I did promise to come back. And I think I abandoned her because my career became more important than keeping my word. The 5th package arrived as Tony dreaded it would, precisely 1 week later. This photograph was different. It showed a young boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, standing beside Catherine's grave with flowers in his small hands. He had Tony's eyes and Catherine's gentle smile. On the back, Chicago, 1960. Your son, visiting the mother he never knew. Package 5 of 7. The note was brief but devastating. His name is Anthony Martinelli. Catherine's parents raised him as their own. He grew up believing his father had died in the war. He visits Catherine's grave every year on her birthday. He's been looking for you his entire life. Tony felt the weight of 70 years of guilt crashing down on him. Not only had he abandoned the woman he loved, but he had a son who had grown up without a father, a son who was now in his late 60s and had spent decades wondering about his origins. "Susan," Tony said, his voice breaking, "I have a son. I have a son I never knew about, and he's been looking for me for 70 years." The sixth package contained what appeared to be recent photographs, colour images that showed an elderly man who looked remarkably like Tony, visiting Catherine's grave, tending to flowers, and sitting quietly beside the headstone. These were clearly surveillance photographs taken without the subject's knowledge. On the back of one, "Chicago, present day, still searching for his father. Package 6 of 7. The note read, "Anthony Martinelli is 69 years old. He's a retired music teacher who never married. He spent his life helping children learn to sing. He plays piano like his mother did. He has your voice, but he's never known it. He lives alone in the house where Catherine died. He still believes you might come looking for him someday." Tony realized that whoever was sending these packages had been watching his son, documenting his life, and was now using that information to force Tony to confront the consequences of his long-ago abandonment. "Who could be doing this?" Susan asked. "And why now?" Tony studied the handwriting on the notes, the careful way the photographs had been preserved and presented. Someone who knew Catherine, someone who loved her and has been carrying this anger for 70 years. Someone who wants me to understand what my broken promises cost. The seventh and final package arrived with an additional element that Tony hadn't expected: a phone number written on the outside of the envelope. Inside was one last photograph. Catherine Rose Martinelli as she had appeared in that first image from 1951, young and beautiful and radiant with love. But this time the photograph had been carefully cut in half, with Tony's image removed, leaving only Catherine smiling at empty space. On the back, "What you threw away, package 7 of 7. The final note was the longest. "My name is Maria Martinelli Kowalski. I am Catherine's younger sister. I am 91 years old and I am dying. I have spent 70 years watching my nephew Anthony wonder why his father never loved him enough to stay. I have spent 70 years watching him blame himself for something that was never his fault. You were famous and important and busy. Catherine was just a girl who believed your lies. But Anthony is a good man who deserves to know the truth about his father. Call the number on this envelope. It's time to finish what you started." Tony stared at the phone number, understanding that this was the moment when he would have to choose between protecting himself from painful truths and taking responsibility for the consequences of decisions he had made 7 decades ago. "Susan," he said quietly, "I need to call my son." The phone conversation with Anthony Martinelli was the most difficult of Tony's life. Anthony's voice, when he answered, was remarkably similar to Tony's. The same timbre, the same careful phrasing, the same hint of musicality even in ordinary speech. "Hello," Anthony said. "Is this Anthony Martinelli?" "Yes, who's calling?" Tony took a deep breath. "My name is Tony Bennett. I believe I might be your father." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like forever. When Anthony finally spoke, his voice was shaking. "I've been waiting for this phone call my entire life." 3 days later, Tony and Susan flew to Chicago to meet the son he had never known existed. Anthony was waiting at the airport, and the resemblance between father and son was unmistakable. They had the same height, the same build, the same way of holding their shoulders. But more than physical similarities, they shared something deeper, a musical sensibility that expressed itself in the way they moved, the way they listened. the way they seemed to hear melodies in ordinary conversation. Their first meeting was awkward and emotional. Anthony had prepared for this moment for decades, but Tony was still processing the shock of learning that his forgotten past had produced a son who had grown up without him. "I want you to know," Anthony said as they sat in the living room of the house where Catherine had died, "that I don't blame you for leaving. My mother always told my grandparents that you had to go away for work and that you would come back when you could. Even after she got sick, even when it became clear you weren't coming back, she never spoke badly of you." Tony felt tears streaming down his face. "Anthony, I need you to understand something. I didn't know she was pregnant. I didn't know about you." "If I had known, would you have stayed?" Anthony asked quietly. Tony considered the question honestly. "I don't know. I was young and ambitious and probably selfish. I might have convinced myself that my career was more important than responsibility. But I hope I would have been a better man than that." Anthony showed Tony through the house where Catherine had lived and died, pointing out photographs and mementos that told the story of a woman who had loved completely and waited patiently and died too young. In Catherine's bedroom, Anthony opened a drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was an engagement ring, a modest diamond that represented all the promises Tony had made and broken. "She never took it off," Anthony said. "Even when she was dying, she wore your ring. She told my grandmother that someday you would come back for her, and she wanted to be ready." Tony held the ring, feeling the weight of all the promises he had forgotten, all the love he had abandoned, all the years his son had grown up wondering about a father who had seemed to disappear from the world. "Anthony," Tony said, "I can't undo the past. I can't give you the father you deserve to have, or give your mother the husband she deserved. But I can try to be the father you need now, if you'll let me." Anthony smiled through his tears. "I'd like that. I've been waiting 70 years to call someone Dad." Tony spent the next week in Chicago, getting to know the son he had never known existed. Anthony was a gentle, thoughtful man who had inherited both his parents' musical gifts and his mother's capacity for forgiveness. He had spent his career teaching music to children, passing on the love of song that Catherine had instilled in him, despite her early death. "She used to sing to me," Anthony told Tony as they sat at Catherine's grave together. "Even when she was sick, even when she could barely speak, she would hum melodies that I now realize were songs you made famous. She kept your music alive in me, even though you weren't there to share it." On Tony's final day in Chicago, Anthony asked him to perform at the elementary school where he had taught for 30 years. Tony sang for an auditorium full of children who had no idea they were witnessing a reunion 70 years in the making. A father and son sharing music that had been passed down through genetics and love, and the patient hope of a woman who had never stopped believing in promises made by a young man who had forgotten her name. As Tony sang "The Way You Look Tonight," one of Catherine's favourite songs, Anthony accompanied him on piano, and their voices blended in harmony that spoke to decades of separation, finally overcome by music and forgiveness. When Tony returned to New York, he carried with him not just the knowledge of his son's existence, but a deeper understanding of the power of promises and the long-term consequences of choices made in youth and ambition. He also carried Catherine Rose Martinelli's engagement ring, which Anthony had insisted he keep. "She would want you to have it back," Anthony said. "She always believed you would come home eventually. 70 years later, still coming home." Tony never learned who had sent the 7 packages that had led him to his son. Maria Martinelli Kowalski died 2 weeks after his return from Chicago, taking with her the secret of how she had orchestrated their reunion. But Tony understood that her final act had been one of love. Not just for her deceased sister, but for a nephew who had spent his entire life wondering about a father who had seemed to forget his existence. The mysterious packages had forced Tony to confront the most painful chapter of his past, but they had also given him the greatest gift of his later years, the chance to know and love the son he had never known existed, and to understand that some promises, even when forgotten for 70 years, can still be kept if love and forgiveness are stronger than time and regret. Tony Bennett lived for 3 more years after meeting his son, and he spent part of every month in Chicago, making up for lost time and creating new memories with Anthony. When Tony died, he was buried wearing Catherine Rose Martinelli's engagement ring, finally keeping the promise he had made in 1951 to love her forever, even if forever had taken longer than either of them had expected. But the story of the mysterious packages had one more twist that Tony never discovered, a revelation that came to light only after his death, when Anthony was going through his father's personal effects. Hidden in Tony's desk drawer, Susan found a sealed envelope marked "For Anthony," to be opened only after my death. Inside was a letter in Tony's handwriting, along with copies of documents that shed new light on the events of 1951-1954. The letter read, "My dear son Anthony, if you are reading this, it means I have died and you are learning the full truth about your mother Catherine and the promises I made to her. I need you to know that while I forgot many details about our relationship, I never entirely forgot the guilt and sadness that followed my departure from Chicago. What I discovered in my final years through research I conducted after we met is that the story Maria told through those packages was not entirely accurate. I did not simply abandon your mother out of selfishness or ambition. The truth is more complicated and, in some ways, more tragic. In early 1952, I received a letter from Catherine telling me she was pregnant. I was performing in a small club in Philadelphia at the time, barely making enough money to support myself, let alone a wife and child. But I immediately began making plans to return to Chicago to marry her and take responsibility for our child. However, 2 days before I was supposed to leave Philadelphia, I received another letter, supposedly from Catherine, telling me that she had lost the baby and was calling off our engagement. The letter said she had realized we were too young and that my career was too unstable for marriage. It asked me not to contact her again and to consider our relationship over. I was heartbroken, but I respected what I believed were her wishes. I did not know until after we met that Catherine had never sent that second letter. Someone else had intercepted my correspondence with her and forged her handwriting to convince me she no longer wanted me in her life. The documents in this envelope include copies of letters I wrote to Catherine throughout 1952 and 1953, letters that she never received because they were intercepted by the same person who had forged her rejection of me. These letters show that I continued to love her and continued to try to contact her, even though my letters were never delivered and her letters to me were never received. I also include in this envelope a confession that was found among Maria Martinelli Kowalski's papers after her death. In this confession, Maria admits that she was the one who intercepted our correspondence. She had never approved of Catherine's relationship with a struggling musician, and she believed she was protecting her sister by ending what she saw as a doomed romance. Maria had no way of knowing that Catherine was pregnant when she forged the breakup letter. She learned about your existence only after Catherine's death, when she found Catherine's diary and discovered the truth about what her interference had cost. Maria spent the rest of her life knowing that her actions had separated two people who loved each other and had indirectly caused Catherine's death by ensuring she died alone and heartbroken. The mysterious packages were Maria's attempt to atone for what she had done by reuniting us, even if it came 70 years too late. Anthony, I want you to know that I never stopped loving your mother. I never forgot her completely, even when Alzheimer's was stealing my other memories. She was always there in my heart, along with a sense of loss and regret that I couldn't fully explain until Maria's packages helped me remember the truth. I also want you to know that discovering you were alive was the greatest joy of my final years. Every moment we spent together, every song we shared, every conversation we had was a gift I never expected to receive. You are the best part of Catherine and me, and you represent everything good that came from our love, even though we were kept apart by circumstances beyond our control. Please don't spend your remaining years angry with Maria. She was a young woman who made a terrible mistake and spent 70 years trying to make amends. The packages she sent me were her way of ensuring that truth would eventually triumph over the lies she had created. Take care of Catherine's grave for me. Visit her sometimes and tell her that I never stopped loving her, never stopped regretting our separation, and never stopped hoping that somehow, somewhere, she knew that I had tried to come back to her. You have been the son I never knew I had, and I have been the father you always hoped to find. That's the only promise that really matters now. With all my love, Dad. Anthony read his father's letter through tears, finally understanding the full complexity of the story that had shaped his life. His Aunt Maria, whom he had loved and respected, had been the architect of the separation that had defined his childhood. But she had also been the person who had finally reunited him with his father, sacrificing her own reputation and peace of mind to ensure that truth would eventually prevail. The documents Tony had left behind painted a picture of a young man who had been genuinely in love and genuinely committed to taking responsibility for his child, only to be deceived into believing that his love was no longer wanted. The letters Tony had written to Catherine throughout 1952 and 1953 were passionate and devoted, full of plans for their future together, and confusion about why she was no longer responding to his correspondence. Catherine's diary, which Maria had copied and included among Tony's papers, revealed a woman who had died believing herself abandoned, never knowing that her beloved Anthony had been trying desperately to contact her and had been prevented from doing so by her own sister's misguided interference. She wrote about you every day until she died, Anthony told Susan, as they read through Catherine's diary entries together. Even when she was dying, she was still hoping you would somehow get her letters and come back to her. She never gave up believing that you loved her. The final entry in Catherine's diary, written days before her death, read, "I know Anthony must have received my letters by now, and I know he must have his reasons for not responding. Perhaps his career has become too important, or perhaps he has found someone else. I do not blame him for choosing his music over a dying woman, but I hope someday he will think of me kindly and remember that I loved him with all my heart." Anthony realized his mother had died believing Tony had chosen fame over family, never knowing that Tony had been prevented from communicating with her. The revelation of Maria's role in their separation added another layer of complexity to Anthony's understanding of his family history. Maria had been a loving aunt who had helped raise him after Catherine's death, who had encouraged his musical education, who had been one of the most important figures in his childhood. Learning that she had also been responsible for his father's absence created a conflict between love and anger that Anthony struggled to resolve. But Maria's final confession provided context for her actions. "I was 23 when Catherine told me she was in love with a musician. I had seen too many young women destroyed by relationships with unreliable men. I thought I was saving Catherine from poverty and disappointment. I never knew she was pregnant when I forged the letter. I thought I was ending a romance that would lead nowhere. I discovered the truth only after Catherine died, when I found her diary and learned about the child she had lost and the man she had never stopped loving. Anthony eventually decided to forgive Maria, understanding that her actions had been motivated by love rather than malice. She had made a terrible mistake, but she had spent her life trying to make amends, culminating in the scheme that had reunited Anthony with his father. "She gave me 3 years with my dad," Anthony told Susan. 3 years I never would have had if she hadn't sent those packages. Anthony used his father's inheritance to establish the Catherine Rose Martinelli Foundation for music education, providing music lessons to children from low-income families. The foundation's mission honored both parents. In memory of Catherine Rose Martinelli, who believed love could overcome any obstacle, and Tony Bennett, who proved it's never too late to keep a promise. The foundation's first major event was a concert performed by Anthony at the elementary school where he had taught. He sang the same songs that Tony had performed during their reunion, dedicating each one to his mother, father, and Aunt Maria. As Anthony performed, he wore his father's watch and his mother's engagement ring, finally bringing together the symbols of a love that had been interrupted by deception, but had ultimately triumphed through truth, forgiveness, and the mysterious packages that had proven that some stories are too important to remain buried forever. The mysterious packages had revealed not just a forgotten love story, but a complex tale of family loyalty, misguided protection, and the power of truth to heal wounds that had festered for generations. Anthony had gained not just a father, but understanding of the complicated ways that love expresses itself across decades of separation. Tony Bennett's final years had been enriched by discovering his son, but, more importantly, they had been defined by the knowledge that love, once planted, has the power to grow across decades of separation and misunderstanding, waiting for the right moment to bloom into connection and forgiveness that transforms everyone it touches.